actively attempting to murder a student, to refusing to protect her students from bullies, these are all the reasons why Mrs. Puff should not be a teacher. We're kicking off this list with Demolition Doofus, an episode where Mrs. Puff quite literally tries to kill SpongeBob. So the episode starts with SpongeBob doing his usual driving test disaster, where he keeps crashing into the same damn car until Mrs. Puff swells up like a balloon. I'm pretty sure it's a blood pressure thing. Eventually, she's so inflated that she launches the car into the air, only for SpongeBob to ram it straight into the lighthouse. Mrs. Puff is left with permanent damage. She can't puff anymore, basically crippled, as SpongeBob so thoughtfully jokes in such a cruel way.
I guess we'll have to call you Mrs. Pop.
She nearly strangles him right then and there, forcing him to apologize before the doctor steps in to tranquilize both of them so they'll shut up. To her credit, Mrs. Puff probably could have gotten away with justifiable homicide there. Once she's in the hospital, here comes SpongeBob again, rolling in with hundreds of flowers he's already sent, and which she's allergic to, of course. He pushes her down the hall in a wheelchair where there's some kind of bizarre demolition derby going on with beefy guys smashing into each other with wheelchairs. But instead of feeling scared, Mrs. Puff gets this twisted idea and starts cackling at the thought of SpongeBob getting obliterated by the derby contestants.
And I mean that in the worst possible way.
Wait, what now? She's murderous? She lies to him about extra credit just to trick him into being her personal derby sacrifice. Oh boy. Mrs. Puff goes straight to the derby manager, Captain Lutefisk, and pitches SpongeBob as a contestant, even though she knows he's completely clueless. Actually, that's why she's pitching him. SpongeBob's put into the derby under the alias Les Squish, totally unaware that he's meant to destroy the other cars. But of course, he just mindlessly drives around while the other drivers end up crashing themselves trying to take him out. Mrs. Puff watches, fuming as he somehow knocks out every single driver without even trying. Don't you hate it when your assassination target turns out to be competent? In a fit of rage, she steals a monster truck determined to squash SpongeBob herself. She chases him all over the track, crashing through walls, just dying to end him. But SpongeBob's blissfully oblivious and keeps dodging. And I just want to point out that not only is her murder rampage a reason she should not be a teacher, but also how bad her driving is. Eventually, they both crash back into the boating school, leveling the place. And here's the kicker, somehow that impact magically fixes her and she puffs up again. But before she can even enjoy the moment, the whole damn lighthouse collapses on both of them, ending the episode with yet another wreck and both of them in ruins. Mrs. Puff, Educator of the Year material? Absolutely not. She should be on Law and Order. But hey, at least she was unsuccessful in her murder attempt. However, in our next episode, The Bully, she basically stands back and allows someone else to give it a go, so not the best teaching. The episode starts with Mrs. Puff rolling out the welcome mat for a new student, Flats the Flounder. The guy struts in with just one mission. He's gonna kick SpongeBob's butt. Now, this isn't a joke or some playful ribbing. Flats legit wants to beat the living hell out of him.
Seemed like you did mean it.
SpongeBob naturally freaks out and starts looking for backup. So who's he turned to? Patrick? He's old friends with Flats, so he's no help. Mrs. Puff, the adult in the room, the authority figure, the protector, right? Nope. This lady waves it off with a kicking your butt is just Flats' way of saying, I want to be friends. Gaslighting 101. Also low-key kinda psychotic. Pretty sure she wants to see SpongeBob get his ass kicked. SpongeBob is left confused and basically stranded with zero help. Oh, and when Flats' dad hears about the whole I'm gonna kick his butt situation, even he gets threatened by his own son.
Now he's gonna kick my butt!
Red flags everywhere, but Mrs. Puff in particular, blind as ever. Or willfully ignorant. Either way, it's not good and she clearly just wants him to get wrecked. Meanwhile, SpongeBob is straight up panicking as Flats is out to get him, getting chased, almost run over, dropping banana peels in some twisted chase scene that is straight out of a cartoon horror flick. Even after SpongeBob saves Flats' life with CPR, 5 freaking hours of it, Flats is still hell-bent on pummeling him.
I'll have to remember that when I'm kicking your butt.
SpongeBob tries to tell everyone in town, but they're too busy beating up random old dudes at bus stops instead of helping him. Wait, they're doing what now? Yeah, who cares? We have to focus on this crazy woman. Flats eventually manages to catch SpongeBob and spend a whole week using him as his personal punching bag until he finally collapses from pure exhaustion. Turns out you can't actually bruise a sponge, they just absorb the pain. Well, you'd think that would be the end of it, but nope. SpongeBob finally gets a tiny moment to share his meaningful "violence never solves anything" speech, which Mrs. Puff walks in on. She willingly doesn't see all the days of abuse SpongeBob went through. What she sees is Flats passed out and SpongeBob with his fist in the air. Immediately, she loses her mind, screaming at SpongeBob and declaring that she's going to kick his butt now, which I'm pretty sure is actually illegal. So, to recap, not only did Mrs. Puff ignore clear bullying, but she actually managed to get mad at the victim for fighting back. Top-tier adulting from Mrs. Puff here. Victim blaming is not something teachers should be engaging in. But then Mrs. Puff is barely a teacher. In No Free Rides, she willingly passes SpongeBob just to be rid of him. Alright, so this one starts with SpongeBob bombing his final driving test of the year. Like, he fails so hard he actually runs over the French narrator guy. But instead of feeling miserable, SpongeBob's all optimistic, ready to tackle another year with Mrs. Puff. But Mrs. Puff, she's just dreading every damn second of it. Another year of SpongeBob behind the wheel? No thank you. Like any good teacher, she would rather be unalive. But that's not an option. So instead, she just tries to pull a fast one, offering him this half-assed extra credit assignment. A 10-word essay on what he learned. That's it. How could he possibly fail? But SpongeBob finds a way. He can't even decide what to write, practically breaks down, and Mrs. Puff's so done she just passes him anyway. Mistake number 1. Well, mistake like 4, but I'm giving her the benefit of the doubt. SpongeBob's all psyched, waving around his brand new license, and Mrs. Puff starts spiraling. Did she just unleash chaos on the whole town by giving this lunatic a license? Yes, definitely yes. It was a terrible decision for a teacher. But she brushes it off. After all, he doesn't even have a boat to drive.
There's no need to worry. He doesn't even have a boat to drive.
But then she gets home and finds SpongeBob there with his parents ready to celebrate with a big cake and, oh yeah, a brand new boatmobile. That's when she loses it, realizing she's basically handed SpongeBob the keys to total destruction. Now she's on a mission to fix her screw-up before anyone finds out she passed him. What a moron. Later that night, while SpongeBob supposedly sleeping off a head injury from falling into his cake, of course, Mrs. Puff sneaks in and hotwires his new boat and tries to drive it far away, as in far enough that he cannot cause any damage. But guess what? SpongeBob is sleeping in the passenger seat, and he wakes up to see the masked Mrs. Puff trying to pull a Grand Theft Auto and goes full action hero, clinging to the bumper, refusing to let her ditch him. You know, the usual overreaction. Mrs. Puff goes wild. She tries throwing him off, driving like a maniac through town, hoping he'll just drop and maybe die. But nope, he hangs on for dear life until 2 cops see the crazy chase, and now she's really in trouble. When it all comes crashing down, literally into a police car, SpongeBob pulls off Mrs. Puff's mask, outing her as the boat thief, which, of course, should be enough to get her teaching permit suspended. So they both end up in jail. Mrs. Puff finally admits she messed up, apologizing for passing him when he clearly wasn't ready. SpongeBob's like, "Fine, I'll give up my license," but insists Mrs. Puff will be his one and only teacher.
You kidding? You're the only teacher for this student.
And Mrs. Puff? She's stuck hoping the warden takes SpongeBob's tip and lets her out early. Or maybe she really will just end it all. Which, again, is not the kind of attitude a teacher should have towards their students. But then, as we see time and time again, SpongeBob tests her nerve. In our next episode, Doing Time, he quite literally drives her insane. Alright, so this one kicks off with SpongeBob on his millionth driving test. And what does he do? He trashes the entire school, then the city, and even drives straight off a bridge like it's no big deal. Actually, a pretty good test by his standards. Of course, Mrs. Puff's negligence lands her in prison for this disaster. Rightly so. But now that she's finally free of SpongeBob, honestly, she's loving it. No tests, no chaos, just peace and quiet. But no, SpongeBob and Patrick can't let her have that. They have to save her.
I know! I gotta get her out!
These two idiots think it's their duty to bust her out, which they go about in the most half-brained ways possible. First, they try a bank robbery to get themselves arrested, but SpongeBob just ends up talking about his checking account instead of, actually robbing the place.
Sir, we are showing a balance of $0.00 for both of your accounts.
Then they try disguising themselves as the rocks that prisoners are smashing as labor. Like, which of them thought of that genius plan? The whole time, Mrs. Puff is begging the guards to make them stop, but they think she's cracking up and shove her into the kitchen. She might actually cause less damage there. But no, the chaos keeps building as SpongeBob and Patrick literally pop up everywhere she goes.
Mrs. Puff, it's me, SpongeBob.
They hide in vats of chili, jump out of coat hangers, and even crawl up through her damn toilet, which is a very risky strategy, honestly. But every time she calls the guards, they think she's hallucinating and just shuffle her to some other corner of the prison. Finally, they're in her cell, in her bed this time, still bugging her about breaking out, and Mrs. Puff is losing it. She's ripping off faces, screaming for help until the guards throw her into a straitjacket, lock her in solitary, and write her off as totally crazy. Which, to be fair, yeah. Mrs. Puff thinks she's finally free, all alone in a padded room, but nope. Suddenly, SpongeBob's face is everywhere, covering the walls, laughing that obnoxious laugh that could haunt nightmares. She loses her mind, screams, and suddenly, she's back in the boat, going off that bridge again. SpongeBob has corrupted her brain and literally driven her off the edge. Or not. Turns out it might have been a hallucination, or maybe it wasn't. Hell, it's so messed up she can't even tell anymore. She's relieved until she's suddenly in prison clothes, realizing she did her time, but she's somehow in another hallucination. By the end, she's just given up, fully spiraling, and just says,
Forget it.
It's a complete mind screw, and honestly, serves her right for passing SpongeBob every damn time. This is what you get. I mean, this is basic teaching 101. Mrs. Puff should know this. But she apparently thinks she's better than everyone else, which is why she makes a whole video to punish Squidward and SpongeBob painfully. It's boat smarts. Alright, so this episode kicks off with Mrs. Puff apparently teaming up with the citizens of Bikini Bottom United to keep SpongeBob the hell off the road, or some ridiculous mouthful of an organization like that, to basically humiliate SpongeBob and make herself look like the perfect teacher. It's all put together like a crappy instructional video with Mrs. Puff guiding us through the so-called do's and don'ts of driving, with Squidward as the genius and SpongeBob as the resident maniac who couldn't tell a brake from a gas pedal if his life depended on it, so they're playing themselves. First lesson, filling up your tires, which Squidward does with that by-the-book precision Mrs. Puff loves so much. SpongeBob, though, he just pumps it up until the thing explodes, tipping the boat over, smashing half of Squidward's ride, and still acting oblivious to the mess he's left behind. But does Mrs. Puff intervene? Nope, she just lets it happen, all for the educational value, right? This is the role of a teacher in Bikini Bottom. Let them injure one another and get involved when your job is at risk. Then we get into seatbelts. Squidward's buckled up and stops like a law-abiding citizen at the light, but SpongeBob's tearing around with no seatbelts, zipping around like he's on a roller coaster. He crashes into Squidward, who's strapped in and can't move, so he ends up getting launched straight into a spiked steamroller. But, of course, Mrs. Puff is there narrating away, pretending this is all part of some learning experience.
Well, at least he had his seatbelt on.
Way to go, Teacher of the Year! You've killed one person, but don't worry about that. The adjusting mirrors segment? Even worse. Squidward's adjusting carefully while SpongeBob's steering with one leg, fixing his mirror like he's at home, and plowing through a bunch of poor fish on the road. Squidward ends up blinded, crashing hard, and there's Mrs. Puff talking about the importance of not getting distracted. But clearly these lessons are mostly just to keep throwing Squidward and SpongeBob into accidents for her twisted satisfaction. They're not actually teaching anybody anything.
And most importantly, a driver with boat smarts always pays attention to his surroundings and avoids distractions.
Finally, the drinking and eating while driving part. Squidward's all eyes on the road, but SpongeBob's wolfing down a Krabby Patty and waving at everyone he nearly kills. Damn, Mrs. P. Even when he plays his role perfectly, you can't accept it. Typical. Mrs. Puff can't give SpongeBob credit, even when he nails it. Although, most of the time he absolutely doesn't. Like when Mrs. Puff unintentionally sends him into a police chase in Bumper to Bumper. Mrs. Puff is stuck in another day of her personal hell, aka boating school. And she's teaching some random fish who's cruising through the course like a pro. Like, seriously, masterful work. Then it's SpongeBob's turn, and naturally he's an absolute disaster.
I'm all set for my driving test.
Slams it into reverse, wrecks the obstacles, and somehow ends up driving into someone's actual house. All the things you should not do, right? Mrs. Puff is losing her dang mind as usual and totally tears into him for failing once again. SpongeBob, all teary-eyed, runs off home, leaving Mrs. Puff fuming. I mean, she's not wrong, but geez, have a little compassion. But then she has this brilliant idea. Maybe the only way to pass this little menace and get him out of her life forever is to skip the whole boating course and take him to an empty road. She figures that maybe out there he'll calm down and actually pass. Good idea, but also horrible idea. What, he's gonna drive on empty roads his whole life? Anyway, she goes to his house, pretends she's not furious, and offers him another chance. She takes him to this abandoned stretch of road, and it's pretty shady, but whatever, she's desperate. SpongeBob's terrified, and she just tells him, focus on the road, nothing but the road. He gets all into it, repeating the mantra and feeling like a badass stunt driver, striking poses and all. Right when he's about to finish, Mrs. Puff tells him to just dock the boat. Simple as that. But SpongeBob's in some trance, totally lost in his little mantra, and things go south fast. He misses the turn, veers off onto some shortcut from hell, and ends up zooming onto a massive 10-lane highway with his foot jammed on the gas. So now Mrs. Puff's having a meltdown, and then a cop sees them and assumes they've committed a crime and are fleeing the scene. Why else would they possibly be going this fast? He tells SpongeBob to pull over, but what does our spongy-brained driver do? He floors it, sending them into a full-blown police chase across county lines. Seriously, how has she not lost her teaching permit? Finally, he somehow manages to park safe and sound, and Mrs. Puff just loses it, giving him his driver's license on the spot and screaming, "And I'm free!" But of course, it's not that simple. The cops got other plans. Turns out Mrs. Puff's little road trip violates her parole. Yeah, parole. Mrs. Puff is a jailbird. I bet you didn't see that one coming. The officer also rips up SpongeBob's license, arrests Mrs. Puff on the spot, and as she's dragged off to jail, she's raging,
SpongeBob, I'll get you for this! I'll get you!
"You can get him, lady, but you're free now. Embrace that." So I guess Mrs. Puff wants both freedom from SpongeBob and also the ability to harm him. Which may be part of the reason she's so happy when the big day finally arrives. Our next episode is Mrs. Puff, You're Fired. So it kicks off with Mrs. Puff at her wit's end, sitting down with Mr. Fitz, the superintendent. He's all, "Hey, your record is absolute trash because one moron named SpongeBob has failed your class a mind-blowing 1,258,056 times. And let's be honest here, yeah, she is absolute trash with a record like that." Now, Mrs. Puff tries to act professional, but let's face it, she's not entirely against the idea that maybe, just maybe, Fitz will fire her and free her from this underwater purgatory. And what do you know? After SpongeBob inevitably smashes through yet another boat during his demonstration, Fitz gives her the boot and she's practically giddy. Goodbye, SpongeBob! Or so she thinks. Bikini Bottom has a real way of screwing you when you get what you want. In rolls the new instructor, Sergeant Roderick. This hard-ass military dude who stomps in, throws out anyone with even a hint of a personality, and goes full drill sergeant on SpongeBob, his only remaining student. Which means he's the sergeant's best student. Also the worst. Anyway, this guy's out for blood. He's got SpongeBob crawling, running, doing boot camp level training, all just to learn to drive. And SpongeBob, in the weirdest twist ever, actually starts doing well, so long as he's blindfolded. But hey, if it keeps him from crashing into buildings, who's Mrs. Puff to argue? I mean, other people, they're expendable, right? Come exam time, Fitz shows up thinking this new guy has worked a miracle. SpongeBob weirdly insists on wearing his blindfold, but Roderick finally has to tell him,
What? You can't drive a boat with a blindfold on? That's illegal!
well, that complicates things. Without it, SpongeBob turns right back into a human wrecking ball, tearing through town and even picking up Mrs. Puff in the process, who's been happily painting her way through her new freedom. Roderick's screaming for SpongeBob to brake, but this little fool misunderstands and removes the brakes entirely.
Here you go, sir. All I had to do was unscrew 2 little bolts.
Now Roderick's had it. He jumps out of the boat, tries to play hero, and immediately gets flattened by SpongeBob's boat. Which honestly is kinda tame compared to some of the things that Mrs. Puff has suffered through because of his driving. Somehow, with Patrick's pants over his eyes, don't ask, SpongeBob finally manages to avoid wrecking every car in sight, nails the parking, and thinks he's totally aced it. Until Fitz points out the trail of destruction he's left behind. Guess what? He's failed again. Good job, Spongy. Turns out, even with the best instructor, SpongeBob is just unteachable. So I guess Mrs. Puff at least has that going for her. Now Mrs. Puff is rehired back into her nightmare job, and SpongeBob shows up the next day all apologetic, handing her his half-assed gift, her ID he fixed up. Thought that counts, I guess. He's all,
Don't worry, Mrs. Puff. I'm gonna pass even if it takes 1,000,000 tries.
Mrs. Puff's barely holding back the tears, realizing she's trapped forever with this disaster of a student. You know, the more I watch this show, the more I'm convinced that all of these characters are in hell, and SpongeBob is Satan. Just an observation. In case you're not quite sold on that theory, just take a look at our next episode where she genuinely has to do everything in her power to avoid murdering SpongeBob. It's Nautical Novice. So the episode starts with Mrs. Puff at her absolute worst at boating school, droning on while everyone in the room looks like they're about to keel over from boredom. Everyone except SpongeBob, who's scribbling notes like it's his life's mission. I mean, it should be. He fails every time he gets behind the wheel of a boat. She wraps up and reminds everyone of tomorrow's field trip to the Museum of Boating, which for SpongeBob is like the holy grail of chances to finally impress her and score that elusive driver's license. Will he do it? Absolutely not, but it's worth an episode anyway. So what does he do? He pulls an all-nighter reading some massive 7,400-page boating encyclopedia that no one actually asked him to read. By the time he's done, it's 7:59 a.m. and he's late as hell for the bus. He scrambles to catch up, and Mrs. Puff, who's secretly hoping to ditch him and have a day of peaceful teaching, tells the bus driver to hit the gas.
Step on it!
Which, again, horrible teacher behavior there. But SpongeBob, defying all odds, catapults himself through the bus window and lands right next to her. She immediately clocks his stench and sprays him with shower in a can, but that doesn't stop his endless rambling about boat trivia. She's already regretting her life choices, mostly choosing to become a teacher. That one was a big mistake. When they finally get to the museum, SpongeBob is still yapping on about boating. He's so lost in his own little world that he crashes face first into the door, turning into a puddle, then somehow reforms, still talking. She cannot catch a break. Mrs. Puff tries to give a tour, but SpongeBob keeps stealing her spotlight, spouting off trivia before she can get a word in. By the time they're supposed to leave, she realizes the walking disaster has vanished. Turns out he's in the driver's room of the boat, having an unsupervised field day. And then it happens. SpongeBob, idiotically fiddling with the controls, cranks up the air conditioning so high it accidentally kickstarts the boat. Mrs. Puff is horrified. She's never handled something this advanced. She's in full panic mode as SpongeBob, delusional as ever, tries some half-baked sailor moves to save the day, flipping switches, babbling about tailspins, and who knows what else. Just as it's about to flatten the city, the boat barely taps a building. Mrs. Puff, somehow impressed by this absurd near miss, hands him a license. Even she has to admit that he really pulled off something truly impressive there. But here's the kicker. The museum owner strolls over, casually explaining the boat was just on autopilot for its routine checkup. Furious, Mrs. Puff rips up SpongeBob's license. The owner offers ice cream to calm him down, but SpongeBob, in true form, notices the headlights are on and bolts back into the museum, flipping the boat upside down in seconds. Mrs. Puff inflates as the episode ends, reminding us one final time that she has some serious rage problems.
Good thing you studied.
But then I guess when you're around SpongeBob all the time, who doesn't? Well, it's about to get a lot worse for her. This next episode, Summer Job, sees Mrs. Puff forced to take a job where SpongeBob has to teach her. Lord help her. Alright, so it's the end of the school year at Mrs. Puff's boating school, and SpongeBob decides to give her a note. Naturally, she's horrified and will do anything to avoid it. It's like he's handing her a restraining order or something, although she would actually love one of those from him. She straight up flees, but the note gets in her face and she ends up slamming right into the Krusty Krab, totally trashing the doors. Nice driving, Mrs. Puff. Because of her little hit and run, Mr. Krabs forces her to work off the damage as a Krusty Krab cashier, while Squidward conveniently scores a summer vacation. So now Mrs. Puff's the one taking orders under SpongeBob's guidance. Lord help her with this one. Of course, SpongeBob goes full trainer mode and pretends to be some ridiculous customer, Duke Thomas Feathermuffin, ordering beans on toast, something the Krusty Krab doesn't even serve, but which, according to the British, is delicious, which means it's probably not. Anyway, Mrs. Puff's trying to hold it together, scribbling down the order, but SpongeBob just keeps egging her on about what to say. When a real customer finally shows up, she tries to serve a Krabby Patty, but she somehow manages to trip on a barrel and wrecks the Krusty Krab again. Like, totally wrecks it. She and SpongeBob tumble into the ceiling and come crashing down. Humiliated, she bolts out of the place and furiously rips up SpongeBob's note right in front of a cop, which, of course, gets her arrested. Again. Probably a good outcome for her, all things considered. But here's where things really go to hell for her. Mrs. Puff thinks jail means she's finally SpongeBob free, but no. Karma's a sick joke and she gets assigned to a driver's ed class. She's feeling smug at first, thinking it's going to be a breeze. This is literally her job. But then she realizes who's teaching. None other than SpongeBob. Of course it is. This nightmare of a sponge is standing there with a patched-up version of that cursed note, and he finally reveals what it says.
Dear Mrs. Puff, I'm following in your footsteps and got a job as a driver's ed teacher for the summer. Heart, SpongeBob.
She's absolutely horrified, realizing all her attempts to dodge him only landed her here in this fresh hell, with absolutely no choice but to spend time with him.
Get me out of here!
She tries to make a break for it, screaming bloody murder, but the cop stops her, sealing her fate. Seriously, how the hell did she get a job as a teacher? I guess the good news is that she won't be in that position for too much longer. Especially since she falls in love with SpongeBob's money-hungry boss, Mr. Krabs, in our next episode, Krusty Love. Very professional. Alright, this episode starts with Mr. Krabs flipping out over a missing penny. Again, like, really, he's so obsessed with cash he's crying over a penny. There's nothing else in his life, after all. But all that changes when he spots Mrs. Puff and decides he's in love, instantly dropping his money is everything shtick.
Mr. Krabs, say hello.
SpongeBob's all like, I'll introduce you. Even though Mr. Krabs is freaking out, claiming he's too old for love. But SpongeBob does it anyway. And Krabs, he's a stammering, bumbling mess, like full-on nonsense words and weird dance moves. But somehow this works, and Mrs. Puff agrees to go out with him. So we know her standards are pretty low, which is something in his favor. So Mr. Krabs decides to pull out all the stops for their fancy date. He spends like there's no tomorrow. Foot rubs, caricatures, a scuba band, and a limo. But then comes the bill, and it's no joke. It's actually a nightmare. Mr. Krabs nearly passes out seeing he spent $100,000. I would also have that reaction, if we're being honest. Mrs. Puff ain't worth that. Back at home, he's practically drowning in regret, bawling to SpongeBob about how he lost control of the budget he did not have. He's still hooked on Mrs. Puff, though, and comes up with a genius idea to bring SpongeBob on their next date to stop him from blowing his entire wallet again. Because apparently, self-control is not on the menu for Krabs. On date 2, they start simple, just a stroll to the park, which will cost him no money. But then Mr. Krabs goes and ruins it by sending SpongeBob to buy flowers, chocolates, and all these fancy gifts he supposedly needs to impress Mrs. Puff. And every time SpongeBob returns with the goods, Mr. Krabs loses his mind, yelling at him for making him spend money, even though it was his idea in the first place. SpongeBob finally calls him out for the hypocrite he is, and Mr. Krabs just keeps whining about not wanting to lose Mrs. Puff. He has no idea that all he has to do to win her over is execute SpongeBob. But hey, that's his loss. Anyway, Mrs. Puff is just sitting there on a pile of ridiculous presents, waiting for their date to actually start. And by this point, SpongeBob's finally had it, so he lets loose, snaps at Krabs, and storms off. Mrs. Puff, who's seen all this, walks up to Krabs, and she's actually pretty chill about the whole thing. She says she doesn't even want all this expensive crap and suggests they just go Dutch. I don't know what that means. I don't want to know what that means, but good for them, I guess. Then she kisses him, and Mr. Krabs is left stunned, totally in love, broke as hell, but happy. And in true SpongeBob fashion, we will never, ever talk about this relationship ever again.